Okay, thank you. Good morning. I'm sorry you cannot see me, but I having experiencing troubles with my camera, and this caused this delay here. So I'm going to speed up a little bit. Sorry for that. So my talk today is about telework and its urban mobility implications. So telework, that the topic and the term appeared in the 1970s during the first oil crisis, and the term was coined as telecommuting. And the idea was that people, in order to save fuel, they could stay and work from home. And during the 70s and early 1980s, it was seen as something very positive. There was a lot of rosy forecasts about the uptake of telework. But up to the year of 2019, so prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, only about 5% of the workforce of the European Union was engaged in any form of telework. So basically was a niche practice. So since its beginning, or more precisely, since the 1990s, early 1990s, people start thinking about telework as a way to reduce travel and travel impact. So basically, if people could work from home, then there will be no need to commute, and therefore a lot of kilometers traveled will be spared, and also its emissions and so on will be reduced. So it was seen as mostly as a positive thing. And so it's created a series of research in this topic. Um, and the first studies in the beginning of the 90s, they tended to be very positive, saying that telework actually saved travel. But later studies, more in the beginning of the 2000s, started to create a series of doubts about this conclusion, basically saying that people would either use that time saved in travel to travel even further to other purposes, or that this would allow them to live further away from home, from work, therefore reducing the benefits that could arise from telework. Um, and this slide, you can see a distribution of papers and the attention that telework has raised. And you see there are some waves, but after during the pandemic, there is the big growth of telework. Of course, most of the papers are from the United States, and the results, as we can see here, although there is a majority of studies that says almost 50% of them that says that it reduces travel. There are some that say that it increases travel, others that is neutral. So there is no point in engaging in telework as a travel demand management measure. Or there are several of them, not almost 30%, that are ambiguous, saying that we actually cannot say anything that if it saves travel or not. So, what are the reasons that can justify these different results? So, there are some ways of how people approach this, and there are several methodological components that influence the result of the study. So, sample sizes, a lot of studies tend to rely on small samples, which suffer from selectivity bias. And so, this is also something that influences. Uh, Use of travel diaries that some studies use, and most of the studies use only single day or 2 day travel uh, diaries, so they cannot control for the shifting of trips between the days of telework to other days that are not included in the trips. The way that telework is measured and how it is embedded in the travel diaries, and then different ways of looking at causality bias, self-selection, etc. So all of these leads to or helps to explain the different contradictory results that we obtained so far. So, but there are some things that we know, and this is for me the most important aspect of the issues of telework. So we know, and this has it exists a remarkable consistency, is that teleworker households tend to be located more in suburban areas. This is not universal, but it reflects a little bit the spatial patterns in the United States, where most of the studies have been doing. Um, and so there is this idea that telework allows people to live further away from their jobs, because if I don't have to commute every day, then I can accept a commute of 1 or 2 hours if I only have to go to the office a couple of days a week. So what is being said is that in the long term, there is this hypothesis that telework could contribute to the dispersion of employment and also to the dispersion of homes. And this is, for example, when people use economic models to model the effect of telework, because the economic models consider that residential location is a function of commuting costs. Therefore, if I introduce telework in the model, what happens is a dispersion almost automatically. So there is this problem, which is something that is being plaguing these studies in telework, and which we haven't found so far any final result, is the issue of causality between telework and residential location. So is it telework an enabler of residential relocation or residential location, or people start to telework as a way to reduce commute costs? And the direction of this causality has different implications in terms of policies that could be considered in terms of telework. So, and now I come to a series of case studies from a project that I've led until recently, which ended recently, which was about telework and residential location, online shopping, and it was motivated by the impact of COVID-19. So we see that COVID-19 has increased a lot the practice of telework, going from less than 5% or around 5% about um, to about 20%. Yeah. So, and we can see that after the pandemic, there was a reduction in telework, but nevertheless, the results remain stable. So there is a lot of speculation about that telework will probably end. Um, what we see from a series of statistics is that full-time telework, so teleworking 5 times a day, um, it is something that probably is going to be only engaged by a minority of people. But what we have been calling hybrid work is something that is here for stay, because it has been accepted by a lot of people and employers. So, and I'm going to talk now about two surveys that we've made, one during the later stages of the pandemic, which is international in scope. So we did it here in the Lisbon metropolitan area, we did it in Istanbul, and in Brazil in Porto Alegre. And it was disseminated through mailing lists and social media, so it suffers from the problems of some bias and self-selection. We collected most of our sample in Lisbon, about half of the size of the sample in Lisbon in Istanbul, and just about around 150 or something samples in Porto Alegre in Brazil. And the survey is very comprehensive. It includes not just aspects about practices of telework, but we do one thing that is relevant from the purpose of relating telework with travel, which we have a 5 days um, travel and telework diary, in which we also control for not just full day telework, but also part day telework. And then attitudes, perceptions, residential preferences, and satisfaction. And so this is just a brief example of our data set and this comparison with the region. And so the first of the case studies that we did was relating the intention to telework after the pandemic, so what people would want to do after the pandemic, with residential preferences and perceptions about telework. So the idea is to see if people that want to telework more prefer to live in suburban areas than in central areas. And so this is the result of our case. So what we can see here is that preference for living in a suburban area actually influence the intention to telework in the future, either because it goes through the preference for accessibility, which the result is negative, but then we have like an influence of pass through the people being positive about telework. And one of the things that they mention about being positive about telework is reducing their commuting costs and having good conditions to telework, which are associated with bigger houses and probably a detached house, which is much more common in the suburbs. And so all of this tends to increase the intention to telework in the future. So people that are willing to telework more frequently are more likely to live in suburban locations and have preferences associated with this type of urban environments. And so the perceptions about telework act in this case as mediators for residential preferences. Um, and so these results, what we can see here is that they support the premise that telework acts as a mechanism to reduce commuting burden. So from this first study, what we can say is that telework doesn't lead directly to sprawl, but it allows individuals to transform their residential preferences into reality. So if I have a residential preference, to a suburban area, if I can telework, then this will enable me to fulfill my preferences. The second type of study that we engage with this first data set is looking at the intention to move. So if we have if you have teleworkers that have suburban living preferences, then what will happen is that if these people are dissonant from the place that they live. So basically, if I am a teleworker that have a suburban preference and I live in a central area, then if I engage in telework, then this will allow me to fulfill my desire of moving to the suburbs. So the idea was looking at potential people that would be teleworkers that were what we might call suburban dissonance. So basically, people that have a preference for an area with suburban characteristics, but happen to live in a more central area. So this is what is. And so the idea was looking at if attitudes about telework or living in a place that have characteristics similar to the 15-minute city or the residential satisfaction constructs would be influenced by residential dissonance, and therefore this will all lead to the intention to move. And because we are talking about suburbanites that are dissonant, so what is likely to happen is that if these people will have an intention to move, their intention to move will be to the suburbs. So this is the results that we have obtained. And what we see from here is that there is an effect from dissonance, a positive effect from dissonance for the intention to move, and also aspects related with telework and with satisfaction also increase the intention to move. But these effects, the direct effect from dissonance is non-significant, at least if you consider a p-value of 5%. But what we see is that the most important aspects that lead people to move is what we call traditionally the most important aspect. So living in a small house, being a renter instead of being an owner, having a household with children, and being younger, these are aspects that are related with people intending to move. So the most important factors are these ones. And of course, if these ones are satisfied, then if people are dissonant, then they will tend to move. So the attitudes about telework don't influence the decision to move, and teleworking practices. So if I telework, they do it, but with a very low magnitude and a significance level that is very close to the cutoff thresholds. Another thing that was interesting from this data is that experienced teleworkers, so people who telework prior to the COVID pandemic, are more satisfied with their residential location. Probably because these people have jobs that are associated with higher incomes, so they have a resource characteristic that allows them more easily to be located in the place that they prefer to live. One of the things that was interesting is that people don't seem to be very much in favor of the characteristics of the 15-minute city. So basically what we found from here, and this is a result that I think it's interesting, but doesn't go directly towards telework, but people that live in places that are more aligned with the 15-minute city concept are more satisfied with the accessibility that they have, but are less satisfied with the quality of public space. So it means that there is a preference for suburban locations for more quieter areas. So this is basically what I've been saying. So I'm going to skip this slide for the sake of brevity. So now another study with the first elements, which was looking if telework reduces or increases travel. And so from this data, we put together all of the data from Lisbon, Istanbul, and Porto Alegre, and we built a model, which is this one that I'm showing you right now, which was a structural equation model in which you consider the full day telework, the part-time telework, the previous telework practices, and the attitudes towards telework. So what we see from here, and the importance of this study is that it shows us that we are controlling for a multicultural set with cities with totally different characteristics, both in space, but also culturally. So what the results show us here is that telework reduces trips by public transport and by private car. But in a certain way, it increases trips by non-motorized modes. On the contrary, part-day telework increases the number of trips. In this case, we are not looking at travel distances, which is the thing that relates more directly towards the emissions of greenhouse gases, because for this survey we didn't have neither travel times nor OD pairs for this trip, so we cannot measure the trip distances specifically. So what we can see here, what is the main takeaways from this study, is that more frequent telework reduces the number of trips by all modes. Partial telework increases travel, so staying one morning or one afternoon at home and then going to the office actually increases travel. Uh, Being positive about telework reduces travel because it increases telework frequency. Um, and so we see a reinforcement effect from the experience in telework. So if I'm more experienced in telework, I tend to be more positive about this practice. Therefore, I telework more often. And in this case, I make a lower number of trips. But there is a thing that is in agreement with other results in the literature, which is lower commuting time makes people less positive about telework and basically doing more trips. We see some regional differences. Istanbul is quite different because of the sheer size and the characteristics of the area. But another thing which is also important is that it's not just telework that is important in reducing trips and or increasing the number of trips by different modes, but actually living in a more central area has a positive effect on the number of non-motorized trips and reduces the number of motorized trips, particularly by car. So now this data that we collected during the pandemic led us to do a much bigger and much more I would say, ambitious data collection plan, which was a survey that happened already after the pandemic, between October and December 2023. We looked into a sample of almost 2,000 individuals in the Lisbon metropolitan area, employed people with jobs in the service sector, so compatible with telework. And the survey has a series of components. So social economic characteristics, travel and shopping diaries, 7 days. And it is not just the 5 week working days that we collected in the previous survey, but already including the weekends, attitudes towards teleworking, shopping, mobility and residential preferences. And then it included also something that I'm not going to talk here, which was a stated preference survey regarding residential relocation. And so we come here with three profiles, and these three profiles were not embedded in the sample. They resulted from our analysis of the sample. So we have people that we say never teleworked, which is about 36% of our sample. We have people that started to telework during the pandemic and continued after the pandemic. So what we call inexperienced teleworkers, which is about 47% of our sample. And we have the experienced teleworkers, which is basically about 70% of our sample, which is people that teleworked regularly before the pandemic. And now I'm going to show you some similarities and some differences between these three segments, which show us some interesting insights. So, first of all, what we see here is that the non-teleworkers are mostly women. Our sample is representative of the population, the employed population working in the Lisbon metropolitan area. So these non-teleworkers are mostly women, or then compared with the other segments. Of course, people working in the service sector we have more women than men in this type of professions. Therefore, our sample has a higher proportion of women than men. But it shows also that experienced teleworkers are tend to be more have a higher percentage of males, which also explains some of the structures that we have in the job market, which basically these people tend to have more higher education, higher incomes, and professions with more managerial or with a higher level of degree. So this way, the sample captures the current situation that we see in social economic surveys that say that tend to earn more than women, tend to have better paid jobs, and tend to be more in positions of leadership. So it reflects these patterns that we see in other places. Another thing that is interesting, so there is in terms of mode choice for commuting, both non-teleworkers and experienced teleworkers tend to use more the car. Uh, New teleworkers are more use more public transportation. Um, and then the commuting duration actually shows that experienced teleworkers tend to have a commuting duration in the middle, reflecting that these people have higher incomes. They are allowed to locate themselves in the places that they prefer. Also, another thing, which is experienced teleworkers also tend to have a spouse that is more likely to telecommute also. So what we can say is that new teleworkers, they have less habilitation level, so are less educated, and have lower incomes. So we can say, because we are talking about service sector, so more administrative stuff, the new teleworkers tend to be like an average group, which basically we can say intermediate staff, and experienced teleworkers tend to be more experts and managers. In terms of residential location, so experienced teleworkers live in bigger houses uh, and are more likely to be owners, and they live in the place where they live for a shorter time than the other ones on average. Also interesting is that the people that never telework tend to live in more in detached or semi-detached houses than the other segments, but the differences are not so big, which reflects also a pattern that these people might also live in more suburban areas, which is not related with the intention to telework, but with the disparities in terms of housing costs in the region of Lisbon. Another interesting thing that we look at the travel patterns of these people. And so car is the majority of the modes for them. But what we see is that experienced teleworkers use less public transportation than all the other segments by a margin of almost 5% compared to the non-teleworkers, or around 2% for the non-teleworkers. So what we see is that experienced teleworkers uh, use the car more often than inexperienced teleworkers, and they use public transportation less. So the takeaway from here is that what we see is that, and looking at the data in terms of the average number of trips by weekdays and by days that they telework, days that they don't telework, in general, teleworkers tend to travel less in general, but the issue is that they travel less by public transportation than the non-teleworkers. So the reduction in terms of travel, it's more pronounced for public transportation, which is not so good news for public transportation operators. So,
Well, let me just tell you that at some point we will have to have some space or time for questions from the attendees. So
okay.
I don't know how long you're gonna make it to the end, but maybe we should make it shorter. Okay.
Okay. So this new this work is basically it's another work which is relating telework and online shopping. So if people that telework more tend to shop more online or shop more in store, which is related also not just so much with with the components related with trips by itself, but also logistics and also the location and of shops in the area and therefore street vitality. So what we get from here is that people that telework more tend to shop more online during work days and use Uber Eats or all of these services more frequently, both during work days and weekends. People that telework less tend to shop more in store for foodstuffs during weekends and eat out more during work days. Also, when we look at the patterns of people that telework more, that shop more online, they tend to be more educated and more and younger. And people that use more Uber Eats type of services tend also to be more young and live in more central areas. But we also see that there is a set of older people with higher levels of income that tend to be located in central areas that use the traditional ways of going to the supermarket and buy groceries and eating out more frequently. So what we found here is basically this is the main takeaway. Higher telework frequency leads to more online grocery shopping, both on weekends and weekdays, um, to less eating out on work days and more meal deliveries, both on work days and weekends. Um, and so we see that traditionally older people tend to live more in more central areas, are like to hold to their previous habits, and younger telecommuters will live more peripherally and shop more online. So this is also has a series of implications. Now, this is one of the last studies, which is looking at the effects of CO2 emissions. This is the model. I'm not going to take much time into it. And what we see from here, and this is our standardized effect. So, of course, telework is a strong, is the most important aspect that reduces the amount of emissions from trips, followed by the ownership of a transit pass and being positive to telework. But we also look in the opposite side. Living in a suburban area has an effect contrary to this one, which is almost of a magnitude that is quite similar. So what we see is that telework can reduce the emissions resulting from the trips that we undertake, but only if we don't use that save to migrate to the suburbs. This is basically so it is important to control about the attitudes that I already mentioned previously, the intention and engagement, but also control for the home and work location, which are also endogenous in some of these elements. Then the last of these pieces of work, which is with this new data set, we went again to look into the intention to move. But in this case, we control more for the land use characteristics. We control with the satisfaction with accessibility and satisfaction with public space, which are things that we had also in the previous model. And what we see here is that um, telework in this case, now it has a significant effect uh, on the intention to move. But this effect is once again a very small effect when compared with the other important aspects. So in this case, it's um, it is in accordance with the previous study with a different data set, which is being a renter living in a smaller house. And in this case, we control for higher incomes, and having a higher income and being insatisfied are the stronger elements that lead people to move away from home. So push factor and transaction costs are the main drivers of residential relocation. So in this case, being a renter reduces a lot the transaction costs of moving home compared to owning. Um, and one of the things that is similar with the previous ones is that people living in central areas tend to be less satisfied with public space. So this shows a general tendency towards suburban preferences, which is a little bit stronger in teleworkers, but is not a difference, like saying that urbanites are people that do not telework and teleworkers are all suburbanites. So we see a tendency of more towards more suburbanization, and the teleworkers only have a slight more. Finally, what one of the aspects is about future perspectives is that what we see here, and this is the result, is a strong adherence and potential for telework. On average, when we ask people how much do they telework and how much do they want to telework, there is a gap of about 1 day. So everybody on average says that I want to telework 1 day more than the day that I telework. And finally, so the main takeaways from this is that telework seems to reduce travel and its impacts, yes, but its potential benefits are strongly related to its impact on residential locations to suburban, exurban areas. So if people stay put, then I can say that the suburbanite that teleworks produces less CO2 than a suburbanite that doesn't telework. The problem is that if somebody that teleworks becomes which was not a suburbanite, becomes a suburbanite. And so, thank you very much. I just want to make a small acknowledgement to my co-authors in all of this in this project and all of these papers, Rui, Laísa, Fesea, and Patricia, and these results that I've presented here were made in a project that was funded by the National Science Foundation for Science and Technology. Thank you very much.